So what we're going to do here is take a look at kind of what happened not only after the Greats, but throughout the 1800s. One of the themes that we'll address is the fact that Russia, in many instances, kind of struggled to keep up with developments that were happening in Western Europe. Now, the concept of absolutism, bear in mind that Russia is ruled by a Tsar, one leader, one sole ruler, exemplified thus far by the two Ivans, and then Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Now, there was going to be more of a government role in the economy and a possible reorganization of the government. And there were plans to draw up a new constitution, but the Tsar never followed through on it, because in Western Europe, especially after Napoleon, they were scared of the reforms that had been taking place. All right, it made them nervous. And the so-called Decembrist uprising kind of took their fears and turned them into reality. Now, this is a movement that began amongst military officers who had interacted with the West, and so they've seen, quote-unquote, another way of doing things. Their main goals are to end the autocracy and abolish serfdom. Now, it kind of begins when this man, Tsar Nicholas I, takes the throne as Tsar. Many felt that his brother should have claimed the throne, mainly because he was older. However, he married a Polish woman, and the Poles are Roman Catholic, whereas the Russians are Orthodox Christian. So there was a belief that he had relinquished his right to the throne due to this. 3,000 members of the military staged a rebellion because they wanted these liberal reforms. And the death of the previous Tsar, Alexander I, kind of forced the so-called Decembrists to hasten the date of this revolt. 5 of the leaders were immediately hanged. All right, this was put down with surprising, crushing force. And over 2,900 were forced into exile in Siberia. Now, as is often the case with many failed movements, this will cause the leader to become more conservative. And Tsar Nicholas I will tighten his grip as a direct result of this. Now, some of these reactions to more liberal Western Europe, all right, some of these, in fact, all of them, are designed to increase the power and autonomy of the Tsar. One of these reactions was domestic, meaning they took place within the Russian Empire proper. Now, Russification is something that we mentioned before, but it will become policy during this time. Now, Russification is cultural assimilation, and it's similar to the concept of what we might call the American melting pot. It really intensified as a reaction to the Crimean War and a Polish rebellion that took place in 1863. And this was seen as a way to prevent future uprisings and prevent separatism and force minority groups into practicing the Russian ways. So you speak the Russian language. You accept the Orthodox Church. So because of this, Catholic monasteries were shut down, new churches were banned, and state schools only taught the Orthodox faith. And the calendar was even switched from a Gregorian to Julian, which the Orthodox Church used. Now, the image you see exemplifies the switch. This is a church in Lithuania that was Roman Catholic, but it was then torn down and rebuilt as an Orthodox Christian church. And Lithuania is part of the Russian Empire. So that's why this is considered domestic. Now, Pan-Slavism was the goal of uniting all Slavs under rule of the Tsar. And this was mainly concerned with a region called the Balkans. So think like modern-day Greece, that's the Balkans. And they had been ruled by non-Slavs like the Byzantines and the Ottomans. And this movement began with the Napoleonic Wars and was embraced at about the same time as nationalist movements in Germany and Italy. So Pan-Slavism is foreign. They're looking at areas where Slavs live, but they're not necessarily under direct control of the Russians. Now, going hand in hand with all of this, 1854, Russia goes to war with the Ottoman Empire. And this was called the Crimean War. And it's called the Crimean War because it takes place in the Crimea region. Now, the goal is to get warm water ports on the Black Sea and access to the Mediterranean. They also feel that there are Slavs that are under control of a foreign entity, in this case, the Ottoman Empire. So they're seen as protecting Slavs. Now, Russia has the largest army, and they have a massive land-based empire. And they did also sense weakness from the Ottomans, because the Ottomans at this point are contracting, and they had lost lands across their domain. Really, the only thing that saved the Ottomans was the intervention by the British and the French, because the British and the French were very afraid about what would happen if the Russians won and got more land. Oddly enough, the Russians and the Ottomans did have a lot in common, mainly because they were aware that the Western nations were starting to grow in importance and their technological advancement. Now, this Crimean War demonstrates that Russia is still mired in this medieval, feudal past. And you essentially have two classes. You've got the landowning nobility and the poor, illiterate serfs. And it was actually possible, as we've seen, for aristocrats to buy and sell peasants during card games. The nobles profited off of them, and the government conscripted them for the army. But the Crimean War demonstrated that, Russia is going to need a firm industrial base. And so because of this, Russia lacked a property-owning class to build factories, and they also needed workers. So partially as credit for fighting during the Crimean War, the serfs were freed by Tsar Alexander II in what was called the Emancipation Edict. And this Emancipation Edict will take place 4 years prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, which is when slavery is abolished in the United States. So that kind of gives you an idea of timing between the two. So the Decembrists did, in some ways, have their goals accomplished. One of their goals was to eliminate serfdom. It happens, but it's a flawed system because the serfs had to purchase their freedom. And once they were free, life wasn't exactly stellar. Now, with this Crimean War, we're seeing this shift from a medieval past to a more modern future. During the 1860s, and especially the 1870s, the Russian government began the process of supporting industrialization. So that industrial revolution we saw taking place in Western Europe, it's nearly a century later before it really begins to gather steam in Russia. And this really is going to form the basis of the difference between Russia and other industrialized countries. Russia had more state control, and this all leads to a huge boom in railroad construction. And because of this, it'll promote the coal and iron industries. Now, Russia placed high tariffs on foreign goods, which promoted the development of Russian factories, but Russia still lagged behind their European counterparts. And with the negative effects and urban concentration, Russian workers are forced into unsafe and squalid working conditions that mark the beginning of the industrial age, while the British, French, and German workers are starting to begin to enjoy benefits of progress, like better clothing and better housing. So even this growing middle class of educated professionals will emerge, just like we saw with the Industrial Revolution. But they didn't want to upset the Tsar too much because of their dependence on government jobs and contracts, and they definitely didn't want a workers' revolt. At this time, factory workers are only about 5% of Russia's population, but due to these vast differences, they radicalized quickly. So by the end of the 1800s, over 70% of Moscow and St. Petersburg were recent migrants from the countryside, and the factories were mostly concentrated in these few urban centers. All right, so as Russia struggles with industrialization, it does put them on the road to more nationalism. But it is a challenge because even with Russification and Pan-Slavism, over half the empire is not Russian. So in Germany, nationalism did help overcome these regional and class differences, but it's very divisive in Tsarist Russia, especially due to the fact that the official policy is to harshly suppress ethnic minorities. So nationalism will be difficult, and it's made even more difficult because of the rise of anarchism. All right, during this buildup and period of suppression, a younger generation of Russians are going to start to lose their patience for talking it out. All right, they don't want debate, they want action. In their minds, freedom comes only through the abolition of the state, its army, and bureaucracy. So some anarchists will accept that violence is a necessity. These anarchists are going to be forced underground because secret police were everywhere, and those who were caught are routinely sent into exile. So in 1881, a bomb actually was planted and killed Tsar Alexander II. Mind you, he was one of the more liberal Tsars, but he was assassinated by a bomb. It was blamed on anarchists, and there's even more of a crackdown on dissidents. So just like we saw at the beginning of this lecture, where an attempted rebellion leads to a more conservative reaction, so too will this assassination of the Tsar lead his son to more harshly crack down on his critics.